Hello everyone, I'm Sebastian Y, and this is Principles of Macro. In this video, I'm going to show you some employment data from US history, and we're going to use those data to calculate unemployment rates and labor force participation rates. We're also going to look at some historical data on the minimum wage. I constructed the data set here from figures collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and then downloaded from the St. Louis Fed. You can see here that the BLS releases employment numbers every month, and they've done so since 1948 all the way to the present day. We're going to start by calculating the labor force participation rate. Remember that the definition of the labor force participation rate is the labor force divided by the civilian non-institutional population times 100%. The civilian non-institutional population I have here in column C, just labeled population, and then we're going to need to calculate the size of the labor force. So I'm going to make a new column for that. The labor force is everyone who is either employed or unemployed. So we're going to take our employed plus unemployed. We're going to highlight that cell and then copy that formula all the way down. Now we're ready to calculate the participation rate, which is going to be our labor force divided by population, and then we'll multiply it by 100 to turn that into a percentage. And then we can go ahead and copy that all the way down. So you can see here that back in 1948, the participation rate was around 59%, and we can see how that changes over time by scrolling down through history, and you can see it's relatively consistent through the 1960s. Goes up a little bit in the 1970s, through the 1980s, 90s, but then after the year 2000, the participation rate starts to go down, and we can see really one of the most dramatic changes happening in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, where in April it dropped by over 2 full percentage points down to about 60%. And it has gone up since then, but has only just come back to its pre-COVID levels. So if we look at the most recent piece of data here from April of 2025, we can see that the participation rate was 62.6%. To get into a little bit more detail on participation rates, I'm going to jump over here to this second tab and look at the participation rate broken out between women, men, and then our overall figures, which will match the numbers that I just calculated on the previous page. You can see that back in the 1940s, the labor force participation for women was only 32%, whereas for men, it was over 86%. Big difference there. And as we go forward through time, we can see the female labor force participation rate going up, while the male participation rate slowly goes down, meaning that over time, the participation rates for men and women have gotten closer and closer and closer together. If we go down all the way to the present day, we can see that men are at 68%, women at 57.5%. So while men still have a higher participation rate, the numbers are much closer than they were back in the 1940s and 1950s. Going back over to our first sheet here, we're now going to calculate the unemployment rate. I'm going to make a new column for that. Remember the definition of the unemployment rate? It's going to be our unemployed divided by the labor force times 100 to turn it into a percent. It's really easy to get flipped around on this and divide the unemployed by the wrong thing. So we want to be careful not to divide it by employed or population or anything like that. It's unemployed divided by labor force. So let's go ahead and do that. Take our unemployed, divide by our labor force, multiply it by 100 to make that a percentage. Copy that all the way down, and we've got our unemployment rate. The last figure that I want to call attention to on this sheet is the natural rate of unemployment, which is listed in column B. This does not get calculated every month. It gets calculated quarterly, which is why there's some gaps in the data here. The natural rate of unemployment is the estimated amount of unemployment that would happen if there were no short-run cyclical effects. Cyclical unemployment is what results from short-run economic fluctuations like booms and recessions. Let's take a quick look at some specific examples here. Looking at the third and fourth quarters of 2007, you can see that the current unemployment rate was below the natural rate of unemployment. 4.67 was below 4.9, 4.72 also below 4.9. That tells us that the economy was doing relatively well at that point. But then the subprime crisis happened, leading to the Great Recession, and we can see if we go into 2008, then the unemployment rates started to become significantly higher than the natural rate of unemployment at that time. We can see here in mid-2009, the unemployment rate was over 9% as compared to the natural rate, which was more around 5%. That tells us that there was a big recession going on, and of course we know that that was the case. I've got on screen a graph of the unemployment rate in the US through history, and we can see some of these phenomena that we've just been talking about. Here around 2009 through 2010, we see a very high level of unemployment that is far above the natural rate of unemployment, which I've shown with the red curve. Similarly, we can see the highest rate of unemployment in the last 70 years happening right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and we can see some other well-known recessions here as well, such as the mid-70s and early 90s, and then early 2000s with the dot-com bubble. Likewise, there are many places on this graph where you can see the unemployment rate dropping below the natural rate, which suggests that the economy was in a boom at that time. So you can see here the late 90s and early 2000s certainly were one of those times. The last thing we're going to do today is talk about data on the minimum wage over time. The federal minimum wage in the US started out in 1938 at 25 cents an hour as established by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Periodically, the minimum wage has gone up, and if we scroll down through history here, we can go all the way to the present day where the minimum wage stands at $7.25. But this number does not tell the whole story by itself. So what we're going to do is calculate the real minimum wage. We're going to use the formula that we learned back in Chapter 11 when we introduced the CPI to convert each minimum wage from the past into current year dollars. So remember, to do that, we're going to take the amount of the minimum wage from back then, multiply it by the present day CPI. So we're going to go all the way down to 2025, and we're going to take this CPI right here. Then we're going to go back to 1947, and then divide that by the contemporary CPI for that time period. Now we do have to be careful here. We're going to need to add a dollar sign in front of the row number for the current CPI because we don't want that to update as we go down. We want every row in the data set to use that same cell. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy this down. And so you can see that while in 1947 their minimum wage was 40 cents, and that doesn't sound like very much, it was actually around $6 in today's money. We can then go through time and see how even when there were long periods where the minimum wage did not change, here it stayed 75 cents for several years, in real purchasing power terms, the minimum wage was going down. Since there's almost always inflation going on, the minimum wage staying the same actually results in a decreasing real minimum wage. I've got on screen here a graph of the data that we were just looking at. The blue stair-step shape shows the nominal minimum wage, the minimum wage as set by the government. You can see that it starts all the way down here at 25 cents and it's up to $7.25 today. And then the red line shows us the real minimum wage as calculated by the CPI. If we use this to look at our current minimum wage, what this tells us is that the minimum wage at present of $7.25 is actually one of the lowest real minimum wages we have had in US history. We can see that by drawing a horizontal line at $7.25 across the graph, and you can see that the only time in history that the minimum wage was lower than this in real terms was the 1940s. If we look at the real minimum wage line, we can see every time the nominal minimum wage goes up, the real minimum wage has a jump, but then as the minimum wage stays the same, it generally declines. If we look at recent history, there has not been an increase in the minimum wage since July of 2009, and there has been quite a bit of inflation since then. When that minimum wage first came to be, we can see that right here, that was, in today's terms, a little under $11 compared to the $7.25 of today. This has been a quick look at some data on employment, unemployment, participation rates, and the minimum wage. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thanks for watching.